Hello, everybody. Welcome to a Reading League Montana Wednesday Wisdom series. Actually, it is 10 a.m. in the morning in Montana, and it's a blizzard in November. So I'm sitting by fire because this is a carry or follow through chat with Charles Hulme. He's joining us from the UK. Yes, that's in across the Atlantic Ocean. So he is hopefully he's going to be sharing with us what some of the work that he's done, not just some of it. Like he's have a lifetime achievement of work. And we're going to chat about that and just get honest and real and ask real questions. We actually have implementers of the work that Charles has done right here on the call. And we have those who've done language research in the States on the call. So Charles, just to give you a perspective of who's on the call, Sue Grisco, long-term trainer of Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading with Louisa Moats. Lucy Hart-Paulson, a co-author with Louisa Moats on Early Childhood Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading, and another really fantastic book that doesn't get enough mileage, which is Building Early Language and Literacy Skills. It's a really fantastic text. So Lucy's put a lot of energy into building those early language skills. Michael Hunter, you might have met him at the summit, also a fantastic colleague in this work, contributing. Then we have Ann Penn, Tara Livermore, and Hannah Schrader. They're joining us from Livingston, Montana, where we've had an implementation of Language Screen and the NELI intervention tool. And Jeannie Schaap out in Wisconsin, and Sheila is joining us, Sheila Hall from Browning, Montana. She's a principal and leading a school there. So there you go. That's our audience right now. And I won't introduce anybody who else joins after this, but we're going to take it away. So Charles, I have to start with my favorite story that we shared at the summit. And can everybody see that picture? So I had to tell Charles, I was like, Charles, I met you this day in Brighton, England at SSR. And he's like, really, because technically he never really met me. But I want to show you here that there's this beautiful human with the white hair here. This is his wife, Maggie Snowling. And Charles is sitting right here. And this is my backpack. That right there. And then next to him, Hugh Katz and then Dick Olson. And I took this, I hopped out of my seat, had to take a picture and was like, oh my goodness, I am sitting between some of the heavyweight language researchers of the world, and they all came and sat by me, and I texted it out to all my friends. So this is the moment that I really came into close proximity with Charles Hulme, but didn't know him at the time. And then I saw him walking through the hallways at Portland in 2019, the International Dyslexia Conference. And all of a sudden I was like, there's Charles Hulme. And my friend Deb Glazer goes, Nell, I think he heard you. And I said, I probably did. So I turned and I was like, hi, Charles, I'm Danielle. And then I invited him to dinner. And that has been the beginning of our friendship. And, honestly, just an amazing human. I could tell you many amazing things about him. He's a lifetime achievement researcher. He's been an editor of many prestigious journals. But I think what's most important for us as educators is that he's taken research to practice now, and it is really meaningful work. And so I'm going to quickly transition my screen so I can see everybody. Just a second here. I realized my screen did 3 screens, and I do not want it in 3 screens. So give me 2 seconds. Okay, so Charles, if you would, could you talk to us about how you arrived at where you're at and how you've just, your lines of research are decades long and they have ended in some really incredible outcomes. But, we are in this world where everybody talks about the science of reading, and you're one of the scientists, you're one of the contributors. But in one of the things I always take away, I think it takes 17 years for 14% of the research to actually make it into practice. That Tiffany Hogan put that up on the screen at Big Sky, and this is about implementation science, about getting that work out there. So I'd love I think we'd all love to hear about how you arrived at, doing the work and then getting it into schools and getting into the hands of teachers.
Gosh, do you want me to go right back to the beginning?
You can cherry pick the journey if you want.
Okay. So I'm living in Oxford now. I came to Oxford as an undergraduate from quite a humble background, I would say. I felt very out of place as an undergraduate in Oxford, coming from a not an affluent family. And I read experimental psychology. And when I finished my degree, I decided to stay on to do a doctorate. And actually, I started my doctorate looking at theories of human personality development. Anyway, after a term or so of doing that, I thought this seems a very weird area to have chosen to spend the next 3 years of your life studying. And I thought, I want to study something where there might be some practical payoff. And so I thought back to things that I'd done some small amount of reading about when I was an undergraduate. And one of the things was I'd done a single, what in Oxford's called a tutorial, which means you read some literature and you write an essay on a topic. And I'd actually written an essay about dyslexia. And I remember thinking, well, I'm an experimental psychologist. These children obviously have some cognitive problem that's stopping them learning to read. And I thought, perhaps rather arrogantly or perhaps quite optimistically, I thought it ought to be easy enough for somebody with my sorts of skills to understand what the problem is for those children in learning to read. So I switched my thesis and I did a study, which my thesis was actually published as a book. And the title of the book was Reading Retardation and Multisensory Teaching. So I did some experiments trying to look at why methods referred to as multisensory teaching methods appeared to be successful. And the outcome of that research was that I was able to show that for children with dyslexia, tracing around or writing letters helped them remember them. And I did further experiments to show that that was to do with the fact that they had problems coding the letters verbally and were instead trying to code the letters visually in these memory tasks. So that was the very beginning of my academic career.
That is, you did, I don't know if I actually knew that title or I didn't remember it priorly, that you looked at multisensory instruction, because that became a big topic at IDA. And in the years like 2015 through 2019, like, do we have evidence that supports multisensory language instruction? So how amazing that that's where you began your investigatory process, right? That's really, really fun to learn.
And I guess one thing I'd say about that research is that one of my supervisors for my doctorate was probably at the time Britain's most distinguished psychologist, I guess, Donald Broadbent, who was one of the fathers of the information processing approach to cognition. And he'd always spent a lot of his time studying applied issues. And I remember him saying to me, Charles, if you study something of applied interest, there's always the likelihood that you'll find something out that's of theoretical importance. And in fact, I think the experiments I did for my doctorate actually told us something quite interesting about how the human memory system works, which is a long way away from multisensory teaching, which was the original focus of the research.
Right, right. And I was going back through your slides, and I really appreciated, you come back to something after you read it the first time and have a moment in an experience with 300 people sitting around you and you're up in front presenting a slide presentation. And then when I reread them, you always add in a theoretical implication slide, like, how does this contribute to a larger thinking schema, which is, it actually took me to those, like, oh wow, this is, it's a lifetime of thinking and doing the work to get to uncover many things, of which I want to get to, like what you uncovered. I actually am going to show a slide because I think it will ground us in some of the work. So let me just jump to Safari here, which is just a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a slide that is from the actual summit, and it is a slide that addresses a thought that really, the moment I read it, so this is a take-home message on a scientific seminar day. Dr. Hulme starts with this. Oh, nope, not that slide. It's this slide. It's the opening day. It's 9:15 in the morning. We're at the Big Sky Literacy Summit, and there's about 300 people. And his opening slide says, "Reading skills are parasitic on spoken language skills." And it was one of those moments where there was something that really just clicked for me. But what really, and I'd read it many, many times before. If you read the work that is part of Dr. Hulme's long research line, this phrase is a common phrase. However, there was a moment that really happened later after the summit when I started to get reflections from educators and leaders. They remembered that line, the opening line of the Big Sky Summit. They remembered it as like that was powerful. Like it was like the whole kind of meaning of the summit, with you and Tiffany Hogan and Ann Kaiser all doing lifetime work in understanding how language skills are really the foundation of it all. And then I want to show one more slide, because this is a very, very important slide, is this one. This one right here. If you take a moment, everybody, and read that. So the first thought was reading skills are parasitic on language skills. But then what are language skills? And this doesn't say exactly what language skills are, but what it says what they contribute to. And so I'm going to stop sharing, and I can share those slides with everybody after all of this. But, Charles, can you just talk to us about your journey into finding out about those language skills? Because word reading and linguistic comprehension and the simple view of reading are these two different domains. And your long line of research shows us that you really found those skills that underpin word reading, and also that language comprehension leading into reading comprehension has different precursors.
Yeah. So this phrase, reading is parasitic on language, is actually a misquote or a modification of a quotation from Ignatius Mattingly, who wrote a chapter about children learning to read, which I read when I was a student. So it's quite an old chapter now. And Mattingly famously said, reading, by which he meant decoding, is parasitic on speech. And we took that quote and said, well, he's kind of right. It is parasitic on speech, but it's actually parasitic on language, which is a much broader thing than speech. And what do I mean by reading being parasitic on speech, on language? Well, if we go back to when Mattingly was writing, and if we go back to maybe the first half of my research career, I was very much focused on how children with what we refer to as dyslexic children struggle to learn to read, and how those difficulties that they had learning to read seemed intimately related to aspects of their speech skills, their phonological or speech sound system was not developing properly. And that, in my view, was the reason why these children were struggling to learn to read. So we had this very sort of specific view that there was a thing called phonology. It wasn't really the same as language. It's all to do with how speech sounds are represented in the brain. And children with problems learning to decode, print, suffered from some disorder that affected the development of these phonological or speech sound skills in the brain. And that seemed to me I think the evidence for what I've just said is very, very strong. That's kind of true. And then you say, but where do those problems arise from? Why do they not represent speech sounds very well? And Maggie Snowling and I led a project at the University of York, which started in about 2010, I think, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust, in which we did a very large longitudinal study of children at genetic risk of developing dyslexia. So we recruited a large group of kids, approximately 100 kids, from families where they had a first-degree relative, usually their mum or dad, were dyslexic. And we also recruited some kids with preschool speech and language difficulties who'd been referred to speech and language therapists. And we also recruited a large group of children from families who had no history of reading or language difficulties. Anyway, we started this study when the kids were about 3.5, so long before they were learning to read. And what we found in that study was very, very clear, was that the children in family risk of dyslexia, who we were expecting to have this very isolated phonological or speech sound problem, actually, if you measured them in preschool, they had language impairments. Their vocabulary knowledge was poor. They did poorly on a broad range of language tasks. And that study and others like it led me to the view that actually, for reasons I think we still don't understand very well, dyslexia or problems in learning to decode print arise from very early problems in the language system, which go on to develop into much more restricted problems in the phonological or speech sound system. So one sense in which reading is parasitic on language is that early language problems seem to be precursors of the phonological problems that lead to problems in decoding print. But the other thing that we showed in that study and many others is that, in line with the simple view of reading, that measures of children's early language skills, broadly defined, are powerful predictors of their ability to comprehend passages that they can decode. So language seems to actually underpin both of the dimensions in the simple view of reading. Language skills early seem to place constraints on the development of speech, sound, or phonological skills, and also place constraints on reading comprehension, which of course only really gets to develop once decoding skills have gone off the ground. That's a rather complicated answer, but
I almost put up a structural equation model just to remind us of all those lovely models that Dr. Hulme would put up a structural equation model at the summit. And he said, and well, this looks complicated, but I can describe it. So, and he did so eloquently. And we'll make sure you have the handouts from that too. But you know what? I think the gravity of what you just talked about is something that as a speech and language pathologist, I was very well trained in my early knowledge base, my content knowledge base of how language underpinned all educational success. And it was the medium by which we thought, it was the medium by which we communicated. I always look at behavior as a communication of maybe that there's something happening based in language early on in a child's life, and I'm very inquisitive, very curious about why things happen, and through environment, through language, foundational skills that a child may have. But what I am most curious about right now is how you've taken this work clearly from a theoretical to now and more deeply understanding how it is a fact, as Tiffany Hogan put in her talk. These are the facts. There are children with developmental language disabilities in your classroom. And can you talk to us a little bit about that prevalence of students who have these language, what we would call they're neurologically different. It's a brain-based difference. And what that then led you to do with creating oral language interventions and assessments.
Yeah, so I think that oral language problems in school-aged children are pretty common. So the best estimates of the prevalence of clinically significant speech and language difficulties is somewhere between 7 and 10% of the population. So that means, as Tiffany says, pretty well in every classroom, there's going to be at least one child or maybe two with some significant language learning difficulties. Of course, language above all else is something that we learn. We're not born with language, we're born with some predispositions, some genetic constitutional things that allow us to learn language given an appropriate environment. Language difficulties are very common. I think for most of my career, I've spent a lot of my time trying to convey my research to teachers, and I suppose for the first half of my career, I was pretty well always talking about reading. And actually in Britain, I don't know if it's the same in the US, there's been very little discussion in education about language as opposed to reading. In Britain, every school is assessed on how well they teach children to read, by which people usually mean how well they teach children to decode print, not necessarily how well they teach children to understand what they've read. And I suppose I'm on a little bit of a crusade now to try to persuade people in the field of education to recognize the central importance of language to really pretty well all aspects of our education and probably all aspects of our lives, actually. Language impairments, serious language impairments, are such a handicap to people in adulthood if their language skills aren't good. I can think of several people who've worked for me who've had clearly significant language difficulties as adults, and it hinders their progress at work, it hinders their ability to form relationships and form friendships. So I think language, broadly defined, I mean, in a narrow sense, I've just said it's the foundation of our ability to learn to decode print and our ability to comprehend what we read, but it's also the basis of pretty well all aspects of education and most aspects of our social lives and interactions with other people as well. So I think that there are a few human attributes that are more, I mean, some people say language is one of the defining characteristics of the human race, and I think that's true. No other species has a system like human language. And language, our language skills are of such fundamental importance that they ought to be recognised in education as something of importance and relevance in their own right, as well as the fact that they're related to these other things like reading ability, which is maybe a bit easier to measure than language skills.
Now that is one of the most important nuggets to come back to. I think about this one a lot because a lot of our assessment systems really focus on those underlying skills of phonological development. We're looking at first sound, we're looking at phoneme segmentation, we're looking at letter naming, we're looking at letter sound, and we're doing them in timed tasks. And rapid automatic naming, gets put in there as well. And as we know, those are those linguistic markers that tell us more about word reading. But as an educator and as a speech language pathologist, I deeply struggled with, how do I know what this young scholar's life, how they're processing syntax, how they're processing the meaning of the language, all of those things. And those are much harder to assess. And so that's what we're talking about right here, is that we have a lot of assessment tools that can assess word reading really well.
Yep.
And also in the United States, I would venture to say, and some of my colleagues can join in, is that we have other assessment tools that also help us understand how they're progressing on standards, in standards-based education. However, those are not assessing language skills. And it's the language skills that inhibit the growth on standards or overall reading comprehension. And so how do we understand and assess the language skills? So could you talk to us a little bit about how you went about designing some assessment tools, actually one in particular, language screen, to help us do that better?
Sure. So I guess in our research, we wanted a method to assess children's language skills efficiently and quite quickly. But we also, and that's why we developed the language screen, but we were also aware that if we could make this assessment easy to use, we could potentially empower every teacher to assess the children's language skills that they're dealing with in their classrooms. And many teachers, I think, lack the skills and certainly lack the materials with which to do such assessments. So Language Screen is an app that runs on an iPhone or an iPad or an Android phone or tablet. And it consists of 4 tests, 2 measures of vocabulary knowledge, one of which is a naming test and the other of which is a receptive vocabulary measure where children hear spoken words and have to choose the right picture. A measure of sentence repetition, which we know is one of the best markers of what used to be referred to as specific language impairment, or is now more commonly referred to as developmental language disorder. It seems particularly sensitive to grammatical difficulties in children, and also a measure of listening comprehension, which arguably is the most complex test, which involves pretty well all aspects of receptive and expressive language skills, in the sense that the child hears short stories that are read to them and then has to answer questions about the stories, and those questions involve both literal understanding of the passage that they've heard, but also requires inferential knowledge about what's implied by the meaning of the passages, but isn't necessarily explicitly stated in the passages that they've heard. So Language Screen, as I've said, is an automated app. Any teacher or person working with children can use it. They can get an assessment of a child's language skills in about 10 minutes. The test is surprisingly reliable and correlates very, very well with individually administered assessments conducted by speech and language therapists. So I guess I'm hoping that language screen can contribute one part of to one part of what I'm trying to do, which is to get people in education to understand the importance of language. But one way to help them do that is for them to be easily able to assess children's language skills and realize that Johnny, who seems well behaved and quiet at the back of the class, probably actually understands very little of what's going on in the classroom and probably is getting very little out of their educational experience because they have an underlying language problem. And those problems, once identified, can be ameliorated, and teaching can be modified to better provide for those children, I believe.
I mean, I just could start screaming from the mountaintops right now, because that is one of the biggest, oh gosh, you know, while you said that this is your passion, your focus, your soapbox in life right now, I had that experience, as you know, working with my colleagues Ann Penn and Tara Livermore and Hannah out on this call when they got their data set in from Language Screen, and did such an amazing job of disaggregating where students were, their feeder schools. So maybe potential information about which feeder schools didn't have very great, or let's just put on the spectrum of their language appeared to not be as developed as students who went to higher quality earlier learning environments, okay? And so they were able to see the differences in early learning environments. We'd have to have you run the statistics on if they were significantly different, but you know, the numbers alone look like they were different. But Ann Penn, Tara, and Hannah, would you like to chime about, to Charles's point, that his wish would be that we as educators would be able to use this and truly start to understand how language is this foundation of all we do, and how it begins to change how we educate the early scholar in a preschool, kindergarten classroom in the United States. What has been your just immediate reaction to that? How are you feeling?
Yeah, and I can start us off, and then Tara and Hannah can jump in. But everything you said, Dr. Hume, just resonates with what we were feeling. So things we were feeling was that we were maybe over-identifying students with speech language impairment. We were feeling like we were constantly calling on a speech language pathologist for our 4 and 5 year olds to come take a screen and evaluate for SLI. We were also feeling like we were hyper focused on the decoding part of the simple view of reading, and we weren't really paying attention necessarily to the language comps part of it and supporting that. And so what kind of this came from was with our literacy grant, we set an action plan each year and set goals. And so last year, when we were looking at our data, we were feeling really solid with our, word recognition and decoding skills and markers and indicators. But what we were missing were those language pieces, and assessing for that and intervening. We had some language interventions on our shelves, but they were dusty. We didn't use them because we didn't know what students needed those. So this worked out really well for us to pilot the Language Screen app, and it's been amazing. I'll maybe let Tara share a little bit, and Hannah, about what we've found. But yeah, we're just very thankful for this.
That's great. Thank you.
I guess there's not too much to add from there. I think the only thing is, we really looked at kids that didn't have any preschool or childcare. And we noticed that a lot of those kiddos, they scored really low in that language screener. And
Sorry,
it was also
which children were scoring low, Anne?
the kids with no preschool or childcare.
Okay, I see. So these are children who came to school and had been at home all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And would those children be from less advantaged families, more disadvantaged families, do you think, or not?
We should run a statistic, because offhand, I would say middle, probably a few of them are on free and reduced. That's kind of how we measure low income here is through free and reduced, but we should run a statistic to see, because I'm curious about that.
And I think we were a little surprised by some kids that, you know,
Yeah.
come from affluent families that are pretty low. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like we also, so a couple things we've noticed is some of those students who flagged on the listening comprehension subtest are students who needed the most intensive social emotional behavioral support, which makes sense, right? Like they're not understanding what we're asking of them, and we maybe aren't understanding what they're, you know, trying to express. And
imagine how stressful their lives at school are if they don't understand what the teacher's saying to them very well, and if they can't tell the teacher or other kids what they want to tell them.
Exactly. And another thing too that we're starting to dive into mathematics, and what we're finding is a lot of math really it is based in language. So again, I think we're probably seeing some of our students who flagged on the language screeners just kind of struggle when we get to those math skills that require more concepts and understandings and reasoning, right? And then the other thing too that I think is really cool that we're doing, we've set a goal in our action plan for this year to research and vet language strategies, like simple language strategies that we can use in our building. And that's like the head custodian, paraprofessionals, like any staff that works with a child. And Hannah maybe can speak to, she had heard,
it was from NELI.
Yeah. You want to share about that school? Because I think that's really
well, NELI, you had shared in one of our, it was actually at Winans, but a strategy that one school had used about having kids answer in complete sentences. Yeah. Just having that requirement when a kid, you know, when a student was asked a question to respond using a complete. And we also talked about just the language strategy of when working with kids, modeling back, you know, longer, more complex sentence structure with more vocabulary, just making a really intentional effort to do that with students in the lunchroom, at recess.
So I think there's lots of things you can do to train people who work with kids to use those sorts of strategies. As you say, just in their everyday interaction with the children, it doesn't,
And we have kids in specific language interventions, but we were thinking of like a school-wide strategy that we could teach all staff to use. It is interesting because I've screened quite a few first graders and a few second graders as well using the language screen. And we do notice a lower percentage of students flagging even in first grade, which, you know, we've kind of made the guess that maybe even 1 year of exposure to language in kindergarten is, you know, is really powerful in addressing language concerns. So I'm excited to see what it looks like next year when kids are now even in targeted interventions in kindergarten for language. So that was kind of interesting to see. I didn't catch as many students on the language screen in first grade as we did in coming to kindergarten.
I think that's a really interesting researcher side of things, Charles, because of the data at Washington and Winans Elementary in Livingston. I asked Tiffany Hogan about the research they're doing on early identification of DLD, and she said that they're finding, so the prevalence, let's just put it this way, the prevalence, how many were found to have risk in preschool and kindergarten was around 26%, okay? So there's some false positives in there. Those children that do not have a language difference or disability that with good instruction will not flag on the screener in another 6 months. So, right, that's how it would work, right, Dr. Hulme?
Yeah.
And Tiffany said she found 30% in her large sample in that first prevalence, and then it would drop down to more between 7 and 15% with true identified language disabilities. So Hannah, are you seeing lower numbers like that in first and second grade?
Yeah. It's definitely like, you know, I don't know the exact percentage, but we had like over 20%, upper 20s identified on our language screen. And it's definitely under 20 for sure in first grade. And I'll be curious, when we do our second screen later this winter, on our kindergartners to see those kids that just kind of with some instruction and exposure just bounced back into, you know, a more typical range. So I'll be really interested to look at that too. So
let me know how that comes out, Hannah.
yeah, we will. Thank you.
I was going to say, you've just raised a very interesting and important issue, I think, because potentially we could train all school staff in communication strategies to use with young children to support their language development. And schools could have school-wide policies and training and, you know, to put in place the sorts of things you're talking about. And they potentially could have quite significant effects, I think.
I think what's in, shout out to Ann Penn leading this project in her building, had our colleague Craig Busher early in the year do a school-wide training on language and language intervention and overall language routines that all educators and practitioners in the building could do. So she took a step in that direction already. So that is really exciting. I think that there's a lot to be just reported back on at the end of this school year of how things came out and how it was different than years before. And while this wasn't set up as a research project, it's really, it's clear what decisions were made in previous years versus what decisions are made this year that could cause for big changes in the young scholars' lives. So that's pretty cool. Let's go on to one more nugget that you've contributed to the field, which is NELI. Can you tell us about NELI?
Sure. So NELI is the Nuffield Early Language Intervention Program. And in fact, we first developed NELI, the first evaluation of it, its first iteration, as it were, was published in 2008. And in that study, we had developed this language intervention as a kind of control condition for our reading intervention. We knew we could improve children's decoding skills using techniques we'd used before. And we were aware of the relationship between reading and language, and we thought, but we don't really know whether we can affect children's language skills, and furthermore, if we did, whether it would help their reading. So we actually did a study where we compared a reading intervention program that involved phonological awareness, letter sound knowledge, and simple decoding practice with a version of NELI, which involved no reading, but involved lots of talking and telling stories and answering questions. And we found selective effects of the two programs. The reading program improved children's decoding skills, and the NELI program in this first iteration improved their language skills, but not particularly their reading skills. I guess having done that study, first of all, we were delighted that we could get measurable improvements in children's language skills after a 6-month intervention. And I guess this predated the research we did showing how early language skills were so closely related to reading, but then we got more and more interested in language in its own right and demonstrating more and more rigorously that variations of the NELI program, and we've explored various variations of it delivered at different ages. We wanted really to tie down the evidence that this actually did work to improve children's language skills. And I guess that journey has been, you know, almost a 20-year journey actually doing that. Was
the Clark 2010 article part of that work?
No, that was a different study actually. Okay. I guess it was inspired by NELI. Clark et al., we did an RCT, I think probably the first randomized control trial, seeking a treatment for kids who were older, who had reading comprehension difficulties. So these were sort of 8, 9-year-old kids who were scoring very poorly on a measure of reading comprehension, but were decoding at least adequately. And what we found in Clark et al., which again, one of the reasons you need to do research is that the answers you get aren't always the answers you're expecting. But the answer we got in the Clark et al. Study was the best thing you could do for kids with a reading comprehension problem is do oral language intervention without any reading at all, work on their language comprehension skills, and it transfers to improve their reading comprehension. And in one of the NELI studies, we also found that transfer effect as well. So I think there's little doubt that for kids who have particular problems understanding what they're reading, oral language intervention can improve their ability to understand what they read, as well as to understand what they hear, of course. It's the same system.
Sorry about that. My mic was off. Yeah, I brought that up because I think that's an important thing for us as educators to hear. And I was thinking they were connected, but the point that you just brought out is really important, that they're on a different, NELI's early. Is it 3 to 5, NELI?
NELI's really 4 to 5.
4 to 5.
We've just finished a study of a nursery. That's preschool, kindergarten in your terms, intervention. And we've got positive effects of that. And that's a whole class intervention that provides language enrichment for the whole classroom between the age of about 3.5 and 4.5. And we see that. So the idea is that the nursery program and the reception program could be used sequentially to give kids from disadvantaged backgrounds 2 years effectively of quite intensive language enrichment input.
And this is all oral language, everyone. So
all oral language,
yeah.
Totally oral language.
Yeah.
So in the nursery program, we're using pre-reading books that the nursery class teacher reads to the child, that they work with a single book per week. They read the book initially, and then they do a series of exercises built around the book, including that direct teaching of vocabulary in the book that the children may not know, and lots of exercises to do with getting the children to retell the story or parts of the story using their own language.
That is, it's very straightforward. Let me just say that. And I think, right, Washington team, you're using NELI as well?
I wish.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, we would love to explore that further. For right now, we're just cruising with language screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'd be very happy to provide you with a copy of NELI and provide you with training to use it if you would like to do that.
Yeah, we would totally take you up on that.
Yes.
Our school literacy leadership team, I'm sure, would be into that. So we'll take it to them next week and let you know.
So you just send me a message and that can be arranged if you'd like to try NELI out in your school.
Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. And I know Megan Roth is on here too. She has been working to bring some of this work into the Bozeman School District. And so have you been testing some things as well? Megan, have any report backs?
No, we're launching it today. We've been a little slow.
Hi, Megan.
Hi, Charles.
Hi.
Yeah, we're launching. I'm going actually after this to go start screening in one of our preschool rooms. And I would love to touch base with you about NELI and kind of see how that's going too.
That's great. Thank you for reporting back on that. I know it's, this isn't such an important message, Dr. Hulme, that language is the foundation of all that we do in education, and those social emotional indicators or social emotional success, that I have to show this slide again now that we've talked a lot, because I think it's so important. And I put the handouts in the chat box so you can refer back to these slides with incredible information on them. But that language really has that foundation to teaching and learning, literacy, numeracy, social emotional development, and behavior. So really reminding ourselves that it's not a matter of if we should do it, it's a matter of when we can get these tools in our classrooms and start doing it, is basically where I'm at with this personally. I too am on a crusade, Dr. Hulme.
Yeah, we're both there at the head of the charge, I think, Nell.
I think we are. I think some of my colleagues on this call are also there, and they've been there for a long time too. So this is very exciting. Everybody, let's open up to some questions. Please turn your mics on. Ask Dr. Hulme any questions you have. Anybody? Lucy,
So
go ahead.
Wait, who?
Oh, Megan, go first, and then Lucy will come.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lucy. Sorry, Lucy. I wanted to kind of recap this and see if I'm getting it correct, that you are feeling like the earliest indicator of a later issue is oral language, not specifically phonology. And so
Correct,
even
yeah.
if that phonological deficit is remediated and the child is able to decode, that early language issue persists in later comprehension difficulties. Did I capture that correctly?
So I believe that the thing about phonological skills is that they show a very rapid development at around the time that children first enter school. So most children, just as they enter school, probably find phoneme awareness very difficult. And it's difficult to measure that before they've been in school for a few months, I would say, because of this very rapid development. But those children who go on to have those problems seem to have measurable difficulties with what I'd call broader aspects of language, such as the ones that language screening measures at a much earlier stage. Yeah. And we don't really understand this very well. I mean, it's clear that some kids are, some children with early language difficulties have persistent language difficulties. But the children that we would have classically diagnosed as dyslexic seem to overcome the early broader language difficulties and end up with a rather specific phonological problem, whereas other kids go on and have a much broader language difficulty. Yeah.
Charles, thank you so much for your work across all of these decades. And I'm with you on the crusade of how important oral language is. And I know, and I'm excited to look at language screen and see how that can contribute to our deepening awareness and understanding of children's development. I'm wondering about the selection of the vocabulary and the syntactic and morphologic structures that you created for the sentence repetition, particularly related in our country, I imagine in England as well, related to cultural respectiveness, cultural sensitivity, and what's important for a little friend in Oregon or in Browning or Livingston or in England.
Yeah, I think there are cultural effects. And in fact, some people have criticized language screen for not being particularly, in the UK terms, racially inclusive. So we don't have many pictures of people of color in the app and things like that. And I think, as you're saying, there are cultural and sort of possibly regional dialect differences and so on. I would say that any standardized assessment of language runs into those sorts of problems, but I would say that those sorts of problems are sort of details, really, that these measures are good enough to give an accurate indication of those children with language difficulties. They might slightly overestimate that in a particular population compared to another population. But in any given population, they will show a good range of scores from kids who are doing very well to the kids who are doing below average to very poorly. And we're mostly interested in identifying those children at the bottom of the distribution. Although Language Screen does work surprisingly well as a measure of ability throughout the range of language skills.
Great. And I was so excited to see finally some good statistical support for a sentence imitation task. I mean, that's been around for so long, and it was, I think, during that whole language era in the United States, it was dissed as, oh no, that's not going to be very relevant. And yet, as an SLP, fellow SLP with Danielle, it's one that I have used across all my decades of my career. Indeed, it's a
and that is a great measure, right? But if you tell people that you're using that as a measure of language, they say, oh, that's not language, that's just memory, and it's not very, it's not a very bright thing to use as a measure of language. But in fact, it's a fantastic measure of language.
I agree. So thank you for that.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, Lucy. Anyone else have a question? I do have a question, Charles. So when this got scaled up in England, there were about 6,700 young scholars that participated, ages 3.5 through 9, yeah?
Sorry, are we talking about NELI or Language Screen?
A Language Screen.
Language Screen, we've actually assessed 350,000 children in the UK with it.
That's a lot.
Well, when I say we, the schools have assessed over 300,000 kids.
So that, to me, goes back to Lucy's initial question of looking at dialect variation, different populations and cultures. Have you disaggregated data to see if there's any variation in the data set?
The two main findings we've got, which I'm very pleased with and seem very robust statistically, are, first of all, children who come from non-English speaking homes perform less well on the test, which is a pretty obvious finding, but the effects actually are quite large, but they seem to reduce in size as the children get older. This is in cross-sectional data. So 5-year-olds who come from non-English speaking homes come into school with pretty poor language skills, but the same equivalent kids measured when they're 9 or 10 seem to have skills much more in the normal range. So that's consistent with the view that school is providing a language environment that means that these children's language learning is catching up. And the other finding we've got, which is very strong, is that children from poorer children in schools which have a high incidence of children from poor backgrounds have much lower language scores than children from more affluent backgrounds. And the size of that effect is startling. I mean, it's about an 11 standard score point difference between the most advantaged and the least advantaged schools. So that's over 2/3 of a standard deviation. Sorry, I won't start talking statistical gobbledygook. This is a very, very strong effect.
It is. It is. Sheila's popped a question. Let me get to it. Be interested to see how. Yeah, Sheila works with American Indian population, primarily Blackfeet, students at her school. She's a 2nd and 3rd grade principal, but also obviously influential within her school district, but has, oh yeah. So the question is, I would be interested to see how the students in my school score as they are identified as L, English learners who have been impacted by language acquisition and coding between 2 languages, because they're speaking Blackfeet, right, Sheila? Yeah. So,
Right.
so they
Yeah.
get identified as L's because you could probably explain it, Sheila, because some of them have full first language Blackfeet, some have different language coding experience, right?
That's correct. We have immersion classrooms in our school that speak the language, but we also are impacted by the boarding school impact where kids were no longer allowed to speak their language, but we have families that are bringing the language back or they speak 50% of the language. It's a different kind of a code. So they go home and they code in a different, not proficient English. And then they come to school and then they're learning to speak English and learn how to crack the code. So they're identified as a different EL student. They're not students that specifically speak fluent Blackfeet, but they're impacted by the lack of ability to be proficient in language.
Right. Yeah. I think children coming from these minority language backgrounds, again, potentially are at great educational disadvantage. I mean, people say, well, you should modify the language of instruction to fit with those children's backgrounds, but that's often not possible. Certainly in the UK, that's not possible. So really what we need to do for those kids, if the language of instruction is English, then it's critical for us to try to give them the language support they require in the early school years so that they have the language skills to benefit from the instruction that they're getting.
I think it would go bi-directional with the bilingual immersion, making sure those language strategies are also rich in the language of in Blackfeet, or in Kim's case in Crow, but we don't have that immersion situation in Crow, except at Crow Agency probably. So thanks.
I think it's important never to denigrate or devalue the person's first language or the language of their culture. But equally, as educators, if we are teaching them in English, it's our responsibility to provide them with the opportunities to learn English to a good standard so that they receive the education that's being provided for.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody have any follow-up questions on that? If not, we're at a little past the top of the hour and we've taken a lot of your time, Dr. Hulme, so I want to be respectful of that. Thank you so much. This is incredibly informative. I think the big takeaway for all of us is that we'll start moving in the direction of finding good language assessment tools and language intervention tools, and be more prepared as educators to do this work through the work of Dr. Hulme. We had two other great team members at the Big Sky Literacy Summit. We had Ann Kaiser from Vanderbilt with Jenny Cunningham as well. And then we had Tiffany Hogan, and all of them helped us understand more. They also offered us tools that we could start using in our daily lives as educators. So Dr. Hulme is no different, and we thank you so much for this opportunity. I will make sure that if you need anything quickly, here's my email. You have it. If write me for any PowerPoints. If you need other people's PowerPoints, I would gladly get them to you. So any last words, Dr. Hulme?
No, but it's been a pleasure to speak to you all. Very nice to hear that some of you are using Language Screen and maybe NELI as well in the US, and we'd be very keen to support you in anything you do along those lines. And it's been very nice. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this conversation.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great Wednesday. All right, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.